Hello one, hello all. Welcome to the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast, the first and only podcast dedicated exclusively to the avenging adventuress of the pulps, the Domino Lady. I'm your host, Sam Oatley, and today we will be reviewing the recent Moonstone Books release titled Paladins-THE Death. This story was written by Bobby Nash, who has written multiple other Domino Lady stories, and was released in late June of this year. Like many modern Domino Lady stories, Paladins is a crossover event featuring the Domino Lady with a variety of other classic and new pulp characters. Having recently completed my reading of Paladins, I wanted to do a review of it and discuss both the good and bad elements of the story. Before we begin, I first want to direct any newcomers to our previous episode of the podcast, titled Paladins-THE Death Primer. This episode was a brief discussion about the various pulp characters who appear in Paladins, as well as my recommended reading selections to help you understand them. If you'd like to get an understanding of the various characters of Paladins, I would say check out that episode before continuing with this one. I am approaching Paladins as someone who is familiar with these characters, so my review is largely guided by my knowledge of said characters. I will also do my best to avoid spoilers, as I don't wish to ruin Paladins for anybody. So I apologize if some of my plot descriptions come off as vague. So to get started with the actual review, what is the story of Paladins-THE Death? Paladins is a crossover story, with 6 different pulp heroes teaming up to stop a villain named the Blue Death, who is attempting to gather magical stones that will help him rule the world. The pulp heroes are the seductress gunslinger the Domino Lady, the occult detective Ravenwood, stepson of Mystery, the Tarzan-type Kagor and his jungle mate Helene Vaughn, the female ninja Nela Kui, and the Hawaiian warrior, the Night Marcher. All of these characters come into the story for disparate reasons, either being forced into the main villain's plot, or discovering it through accident. Only by working together can they foil the sinister plot of the Blue Death and save the world. I want to start with the positive aspects of Paladins, as there are a lot of elements that work well in this story. The most obvious benefit the story has is its structure. Paladins follows a common template for crossover stories, where separate events draw the respective heroes together as their separate goals converge into one shared objective. This allows us to see all these characters have individual stories that meld into the wider narrative, and it keeps the story from getting bogged down with too many characters shoved into one scene. But Bobby Nash is also wise to put the characters in pairs, as it allows both character interaction and doesn't split the characters into 6 different narratives. In this story, the pairings are Helene Vaughn and Ravenwood, Domino Lady and Nela Kui, and Kagor and the Night Marcher. Out of all of these, Domino Lady and Nela Kui have the best story, as they start Paladins searching for a Nazi infiltrator trying to flee the United States, and stumble across a deeper conspiracy involving mystical artifacts. They also have the best chemistry of the various pairings, with the laid-back and seductive Ellen bouncing off the stoic Nela Kui well. Bobby Nash has written Domino Lady and Nela Kui together before in the story Served Cold, published in Moonstone Triple Threat, June 2022. This experience allows him to write a very convincing partnership between the two women. Indeed, Nela Kui and Domino Lady are the best written characters of the story. Nela Kui not only plays off Domino Lady well, but the rest of the heroes too. She works as the deathly serious member of the Paladins, denoting little emotion and reacting to the others with deadpan remarks. She has a funny moment where she asks Helene Vaughn where she's from, but when Helene just says, Africa, Nela Kui just goes, ah, and moves on, knowing she's not going to get anything else from Helene. A lot of the effective humor occurs with Nela Kui, and her stoic attitude toward the strange events and characters she's surrounded by. Similarly, the Domino Lady herself is the standout character of this piece. You can tell Bobby Nash has written for her several times because he captures a lot of her nuances well. Many lesser-known elements of the Domino Lady are on display here, from the Domino Lady's black dress to her gas bomb pellets that were only used in one of her original stories. All of these elements are used logically and don't feel like pointless fan service. I also like how the story acknowledges that Domino Lady is not a warrior like Nelliqui or Kagor, and has to use her wits and clever tactics to overcome her enemies. The story likewise does not diminish the sensual element of the character, with frequent remarks about her daring costume and many romantic partners. If you saw the Paladins Primer episode, you'll know the Domino Lady wasn't originally going to be in this story until Bobby Nash pushed for her to be in it. And I'm glad he did feature her because she's a standout and makes a lot of the scenes work. And while the Domino Lady and Nelliqui are the best characters, the other heroes do get some neat development as well. The story's prologue sets up the villain, the titular Blue Death, in a very memorable scene. I won't spoil what happens, but if you know the backstory to the DC villain Vandal Savage, you'll see something very similar happen to the Blue Death. I also like how Kagor is dragged into the story and gains a feud not with the Blue Death, but with one of his henchmen, who almost kills Kagor. It gives Kagor an interesting and unique motive. One really cool element is that the Nameless One, Ravenwood's mystical stepfather, actually has a big role in the story, having a tie to the Blue Death and influencing the story's events through his magical abilities. The Nameless One is one of the more unique elements of Ravenwood's world, so seeing him used so prominently is very cool to see. Unfortunately, I now have to talk about the negatives of the story, which are sadly numerous. The most obvious hang-up Paladins has are the characters themselves. While Domino Lady and Nelliqui are written well, the other four pulp heroes are not written as strongly. Save for Night Marcher, who debuts in this story, the other pulp heroes are written with personalities that contrast from their original pulp depictions, and not in ways that benefit the story. Ravenwood gets it the worst, as he's written to be overly haughty and bombastic, a strong deviation from his more restrained and quiet depiction in the original pulp stories. In Paladins, Ravenwood's enigmatic nature is stated to be a purposeful attempt to make him more mysterious and grab attention, whereas in the original stories, he was enigmatic because he knew he couldn't explain his mystical abilities to regular people. He comes off much more like a showman and magician in Paladins than the reserved occult detective he originally was. I had to remind myself several times that this was supposed to be Ravenwood and not Norgil the Magician or any other magic superhero. Indeed, Paladins changes Ravenwood's meeting place to a hopping New York City jazz club instead of his quiet Los Angeles penthouse, partially to lean more into a traditional pulp aesthetic, jazz music, and partially to highlight his propensity for bombast. But the worst element of Paladin's Ravenwood is his constant talking, loving the sound of his own voice and using it whenever he can, a deeply annoying character trait that will grate on you by his first appearance. At one point, Ravenwood keeps talking in the middle of a nighttime burglary, when they're specifically trying not to attract attention. Again, this contrasts with Ravenwood's original depiction, where he was actually quite curt and spoke directly to his clients, instead of doing this Ravenwood's rambling. Even the fact that he has a gun in the original stories is ignored, and his Paladin's depiction just has him punch people and smack him with his cane. I'm not even a fan of the original Ravenwood stories, but even I felt he was not well depicted here. It gets bad enough that you start to wonder why the Nameless One even bothers helping Ravenwood when he's so obnoxious and unlikable. Helene Vaughn is likewise used very poorly, as she has the same basic character type as Nelliqui and Night Marcher, a tough, no-nonsense fighter, just with a gun instead of a bladed weapon. This is annoying because Helene from the pulps was a much more nuanced and interesting character. She was a daring aviatrix, but also a spoiled rich girl who needed to let go of material desires in order to become a powerful jungle queen. She was also Kagor's conscience, having a kindness to her that Kagor initially lacked, and helping him open up to others. The Paladins version of Helene shows little of this warmth and becomes rather bland because of it. I'm actually bummed because in the time frame of this story compared to the original Kagor stories, Helene would have just been acclimating to jungle life. I thought this story might examine how her return to civilization might affect her, but the story doesn't really examine that element of her character. I also hate how Helene uses a gun mostly in this story, instead of using some of her learned jungle skills to aid in her battle with the Blue Death. Finally, there's Kagor, who feels way too lighthearted and comic in his Paladins depiction. The original Kagor was pretty solemn and serious, only dipping into humor when hanging out with his friends or his elephant Marmo. This version of Kagor seems to crack a joke on almost every page, and it just feels really off. I'm not against a wisecracking pulp hero, but Kagor is the exact wrong character to do that style with. Now, an argument might be made that these pulp heroes need to have their personalities changed so that they would have more interesting interactions. But the problem is that the changes don't make for better interactions. In fact, they actually make the characters actively annoying or just unmemorable. Seeing the original versions of Ravenwood and Helene interact would have been far more interesting, as we would see a budding jungle warrior with a warm personality meeting with a mysterious and restrained occult detective. Or we could have seen Night Marcher, a woman who grew up in a warrior culture with a loving parental figure and promise of a great destiny, clash with Kagor, a wild man raised in the worst conditions possible who is slowly rediscovering his humanity through his wife's love. There could have been some absolutely great interactions if these characters still had their personalities closer to their original pulp depictions. So seeing what Paladins provides makes their personality changes feel all the more pointless. Speaking of Night Marcher, while she does not suffer from being written out of character, as this is her first appearance, she does fall victim to being pretty underdeveloped. We're shown she's a fantastic warrior, trained from childhood on a secluded Hawaiian island, but she disbelieves in the destiny her grandfather promises her and has a distrust of white men, as the story takes place a few decades after the American colonization of Hawaii. Yet aside from her distrust of destiny and Americans, she doesn't really have much more characterization than serious warrior who takes things seriously. Even her skepticism about destiny and distrust of white men get overcome rather quickly, as after 2 dialogue scenes with Kagor in a single battle, she seemingly gets over her biases. She also gets a huge development at the end of the story, which feels way too rushed. I won't spoil what happens, but she gets a position and power that feels like it should have happened after she'd had multiple stories, not something she should get at the end of her very first appearance. Indeed, a lot of elements in the story feel pretty rushed in their execution. There's a romance subplot between Domino Lady and Ravenwood, and its culmination feels unearned because they only interact with each other in the climax. We're told they knew each other from previous exploits, but without time to see their chemistry with one another, we don't really buy their relationship. We also get 2 chapters where Kagor has amnesia after escaping from the villains, but this doesn't really become a hindrance to him and he gets over it pretty soon after. Even the villain is subject to this rushed development, never getting much of a personality, and in fact, he is never named officially at any point. He only refers to himself as the Blue Death once, but even the text itself just calls him the Old Man. Of course, all these rushed developments may come from the fact that Paladins is relatively short. It is a novella instead of a novel, only clocking in at 131 pages. And that basically means that all 6 characters only get so much room for character growth. This was a problem I had with Bobby Nash's other Domino Lady novella, Money Shot, where it felt like a novel-length story was shortened into a more compact novella format. While I normally appreciate pulp stories that tell their full narrative in a shorter page count, Paladins really needed more time and pages to let us get engrossed in these characters and their journey. The plotting also has a lot of issues, with a fair amount of fluff going on throughout most of the story. Ravenwood and Helene only meet once, then travel to the climax location, getting virtually nothing to do until the final battle. Kagor and Night Marcher have a fair amount of time together, but 2 of their chapters are just them traveling to the climax location as well. Domino Lady and Nelliqui are the only ones who avoid this problem, as they are fighting a Nazi saboteur right before they head to the final battle. The villain also does a lot of wandering, going from Africa to Hawaii to New York City, and not in a way that really makes any sense. This is only done to help bring Kagor and Night Marcher together, and it makes their meeting feel incredibly forced. When a good third of your story is just people traveling, it really slows down the pulp action and makes the story feel a bit lifeless. Indeed, while the climax itself is relatively satisfying, it gets somewhat repetitive by the end. Domino Lady is forced to fight the villain one-on-one after a roof collapses, then the final fight ends with the environment collapsing around the heroes again. The final goodbyes also don't have nearly enough emotion, because most of these characters didn't interact with each other before the climax. The stories of the 3 parties only intersect once before the climax, when Kagor and Night Marcher watch from afar as Domino Lady and Nelliqui battle the Nazi infiltrator. This disconnect really hinders the whole appeal of the crossover, since we don't really feel like these characters have built up a believable relationship by the story's end. There's also a lot of small things that took me out of the story. Some of these were simple, like the frequent grammatical errors that happened every few pages. The general stuff like your instead of your, or it's instead of it is. Sadly, this is a common issue in a lot of recent Moonstone releases. But the biggest issues come from the dialogue and description, which often come off as too modern and not something a 1930s, 1940s pulp hero would talk like. This is a problem a lot of new pulp stories have, where they don't really capture the lingo and style that stories from the pulp era had, and unfortunately it really sticks out here. We get modern lingo like headachy and butt-kicking in between classic pulp speak, and those moments really took me out of the story. There were also a lot of comedic moments that felt really out of place. During the climax, we get a moment where Domino Lady has to hide from the bad guys, but can't fit in her hiding place because her chest is too big. It feels like a moment out of Ron Wilbur's Domino Lady iteration, and that is not a good thing. We also get moments where the characters act like they're in a Joss Whedon script, snarking about each other like they know they're in a pulp story. Examples include Kagor getting made fun of for his name, despite the fact that a world filled with pulp heroes has plenty of heroes and villains with weird names. There's also a scene where a villain asks why the heroes think he would lie, and Domino Lady says, quote, "Because you're the bad guy. That's what bad guys do." These moments just feel too self-aware, more akin to what the Marvel Cinematic Universe does with its characters, rather than depicting what these pulp heroes would actually do. In fact, another thing Paladins does that is very reminiscent of the MCU, and not in a good way, is a lot of references. And I mean a lot. There's a scene in a museum that throws references at you like the Lone Ranger, the Phantom, and Khazar. It gets to a point where you want to get out of the museum just so you don't have to break out the pulp encyclopedia to know what's going on. There's also a really bad moment where Kagor makes a Doctor Who joke. Yes, Doctor Who. That beloved property that didn't exist for over 20 years after this story takes place, and isn't even a pulp property. To be fair, it is a throwaway joke, and Nash tries to frame it naturally, but it still just speaks to how annoying a reference can be when it's just thrown in without much reason or forethought. The final element I want to talk about now is the illustrations. As some of you know, Paladins-THE Blue Death came out in 3 editions. A standard softcover with no illustrations, a deluxe softcover with black and white illustrations, and an exclusive hardcover with color illustrations. The deluxe and hardcover editions have 10 interior illustrations, and all 3 editions have unique front cover illustrations. After careful examination, I have come to a conclusion. I am 98% sure the covers and illustrations were generated by artificial intelligence. I came to this conclusion for a variety of reasons. The first is the artist, Jay Piscopo, who is well known in many pulp and comic book groups on Facebook for doing AI artwork. The second reason is much of the artwork have telltale signs of AI due to errors that are frequently associated with AI-generated artwork. The first I noticed were distortions of the subject's eyes. Kagor on the deluxe cover has a single half circle for an eye, and an interior illustration with him has no iris at all. One illustration for Ravenwood also has one eye much more detailed than the other. A lot of the artwork also does not show or attempts to hide the subject's hands, as AI artwork has a well-known tendency to have trouble rendering hands and feet. And where hands are visible, there's frequently an odd smudge effect around them, possibly due to the AI generation or an active attempt to fix the artwork after it was produced. Similarly, many of the illustrations have the characters looking straight at the reader instead of acting out the action scenes within the story. AI artwork renders front-facing works much easier than side profiles and shots where subjects are facing away, which likely explains their prevalence in Paladins. Finally, many of the characters have notably different designs between illustrations. On the deluxe edition, Ravenwood looks very much akin to David Niven, but on the hardcover edition and interior illustrations, he has a fuller face and looks more like Cary Grant. Helene Vaughn likewise has a different hairstyle between the deluxe and hardcover editions, and Domino Lady's mask looks notably different on the deluxe edition compared to the other covers and interior artwork. Is it possible these covers and interior illustrations were done with an artist's hand? Maybe, but I find it extremely unlikely, not only because of Piscopo's proven track record of doing AI artwork, but all the strange incongruencies within the artwork itself, matching up with AI software's well-known limitations with rendering. I have a 2% margin of doubt, but I don't think anyone will blame me for thinking this is AI artwork if it turns out it wasn't. Now, you might think I brought this up at the end of the review as a final coup de grace for Paladins, a finishing blow to solidify my dislike for the story. However, that is not the case. I have listed this observation last because I wanted to let my thoughts on the story itself be known first, before delving into the subject of AI artwork. AI art is extremely contested at the best of times, and I worried that many listeners and watchers would dismiss Paladins outright should I start with my suspicion of AI artwork being used. I also wanted to have a whole section to talk about my feelings about AI art and whether I think Paladins could be excused for using it in the way it does. To begin this discussion about AI art, I have to start by saying that while I am not the biggest fan of AI artwork, I am not as rabid in my disdain of it as others are. I have experienced multiple instances where AI artwork is used for non-commercial or recreational purposes, and anti-AI people have lashed out unfairly at the users of the artwork. This is a wildly disproportionate response, and I do not approve of treating others in such a way. I also have sat in and witnessed an AI artist demonstrate how he made his AI art, specifically for book covers. And the process actually requires more artist input and guidance than most people assume. This artist had to do hundreds of generations and actively teach the AI what he wanted before he got anything close to what he actually wanted. And he was only able to do about a dozen with the hour he had to demonstrate this to us. He actually treated AI artwork with an artist's dedication. And while I can't say I approved of his methods, it showed me that an AI artist can at least push themselves if they have the right discipline. I also found there are instances where AI artwork might be a necessary addition to a work, especially with indie publishers and publications that do not have as big a budget to work with. Artists cost money, and while I don't like the idea of replacing artists with computer software, it sometimes is the only feasible option for many publications on a budget and a deadline. The pulp fanzine Pulp Adventures has used many AI artwork in their recent publications, and while they are noticeable, I think they do a decent enough job integrating them into the magazine. They also go the extra mile to make the interior art try to look like it came from a traditional pulp magazine. And while the effect doesn't entirely work, I think the extra effort shows they're genuinely trying and using the AI artwork for a specific purpose. Would I prefer they use illustrations from human artists? Absolutely. But as someone who has done self-publishing before, I know that finding an artist that can deliver quality work on your specific budget can be a huge task, and that sometimes AI will provide an easier solution that grows more tempting the closer a deadline looms. But with all that apologism for AI artwork being said, I will now say that I do not think Paladins-THE Death uses the AI artwork very well. Aside from the frequent inconsistencies of the art, much of the artwork is rather bland and repetitive. 2 of the interior illustrations are just establishing shots of a meteor falling in a museum, and 4 are the characters just posing and staring at the viewer. Only 4 illustrations show any meaningful action, and 2 of them are characters staring at each other in side profile. The covers similarly just show the characters blandly staring out at the reader. In fact, all of the artwork have the characters with rather stoic and uninvolved faces, even if the scene in question describes them having an animated expression or dialogue. One picture shows Domino Lady shooting some Nazi saboteurs, and she looks bored out of her mind. If the point was to make the art have some pizzazz, the final products do not feature any. What really bothers me, however, is the fact that the artwork is often incongruent with the story itself. There are multiple instances where the artwork does not match the in-story descriptions of the characters. Helene is shown wearing a leopard print dress in the artwork of her meeting Ravenwood, but her previous chapter described her as wearing, quote, a simple blouse under a weathered brown bomber jacket. Domino Lady's illustrations show her in a white dress, but she is explicitly stated to be wearing her black dress during the events of this story. In the picture showing the final battle, the Blue Death does not have blue skin, despite that being his major physical attribute. This suggests that during the production process of the pictures, either Jay Piscopo did not read the whole story and only rendered specific scenes based on general knowledge about the characters, or that certain details in the story were changed after the artwork was made, and editorial did not notice the differences. Either event shows that the artwork was not given due attention and will likely confuse readers more than helping them visualize the characters. With all this in mind, Paladins does not justify itself for using AI artwork, as the art itself is bland, misleading, and not correctly used. The experience of reading the story, however mixed the final result may be, is much better without the various illustrations. Out of all of these editions of Paladins, I would recommend the standard paperback edition, as it features no interior illustrations and only has one instance of AI artwork, the cover. I also think that Moonstone Books should examine Jay Piscopo's art more closely, and reconsider hiring him for any other books if his work turns out like the illustrations in Paladins. Especially since, back in May, Bobby Nash responded to a viewer in the Facebook Pulp Factory group who had concerns about the artwork being AI generated, and Nash said that Piscopo told him the only AI element used for the pictures was for the coloring. I have serious doubts about that. And if Piscopo did knowingly misrepresent his methods of art production to Moonstone and Nash, that's a pretty big breach of trust. Again, there's a possibility that I'm wrong and Jay Piscopo totally did this art through non-AI means, but given how many similarities it has to other AI artwork and Piscopo's documented usage of AI art, I have a very strong suspicion AI was used. So with all that illustration talk out of the way, the final verdict must come in. Is Paladins-THE Blue Death worth getting? I would say only if you are a Domino Lady or Nella Qui fan. Their story within Paladins is the best element of it, for it features pulp action and a fun dynamic between the two characters. For anyone looking to get invested in the new character Night Marcher, or you wanted to see Ravenwood, Kagor, or Helene accurately adapted to a modern story, I would say the story is not satisfying in those regards. There are enough problems with Paladins that the experience will likely be dull at best and annoying at worst for many readers. Grab the paperback edition without the illustrations if the Domino Lady and Nella Qui stuff sounds like it's up your alley. Otherwise, you'll probably not be that interested in this story. So that is it for my Paladins review. But before we go, I wanted to share news about the Domino Lady, podcast updates, and closing shoutouts. For Domino Lady news, the only big announcement is that Craig McDonald's Xana O'Savin series will be having its conclusion next year with its 5th story, titled The Invisible Crusade. We will be covering the O'Savin series in December, as the series utilizes the Domino Lady in many of the stories. As for podcast news, not only will we cover the O'Savin series, but we'll also cover the last 3 original Domino Lady stories by year's end. I'm locking in to get these out, so you can expect the episodes in either November or December. I am also putting together a project that I hope to be ready to announce in late November, so stay tuned for that. It may provide opportunities for some of you, so stay primed. As for closing shoutouts, I really wanted to boost Bobby Nash, who wrote Paladins-THE Blue Death and multiple other Domino Lady stories. Regardless of how I feel about Paladins, he has done a lot of great work with the Domino Lady and been very supportive of the character. I have put his Twitter and website links in the description if you want to check out more of his work. I also wanted to shout out The Shadowed Circle, a cultural magazine I work for that examines the pulp character The Shadow. We're getting close to finishing our 8th issue, and we recently re-released the important Shadow reference book, Gangland's Doom, The Shadow of the Pulps, by Frank Eisgruber Jr. You should definitely subscribe to the magazine and check out our other books if you're a Shadow fan. Our website and social media pages will be in the description. Finally, I wanted to shout out 2 publications that are featuring advertisements for us in their pages. The first is the Doc Talos magazine, which focuses on a Doc Savage pastiche with a more sensual take on the Savage mythos. You should definitely check them out if you'd like to see a more adult-oriented Doc Savage character. Basically think Filippo's a farmer and you've got an idea of what to expect. The second publication is the science fiction fantasy magazine Cersova, who featured an ad of ours in their fall issue released back in September. I've been reading them for several years now, both their magazine and their other publications, and they're a wonderful sci-fi fantasy publisher that harken back to pulp-style writing. I will post links to both Doc Talos and Cersova's websites and social media in the description. That is all I have for now, so it's time to sign off. Thank you very much for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode, and good night to all you suitors of the Domino Lady.